Okay, we just talked about secondary dominant chords. You have a pretend key. In that pretend key, you do a 5 to 1. And here you can see we did that here. I left the same example up because I'm going to show you how similar secondary diminished chords, also called secondary leading tone chords. You're going to do exactly the same thing, but in the pretend key, instead of using the 5 chord, you're going to use the 7 diminished chord. So I'm going to change 5-7 to 7 diminished of 5. Up here, instead of 5-7 in the pretend key of G, I'm going to use 7 diminished going to 1. This is what happens in the pretend key. In the key of C, this is what's actually happening. It's 7 diminished going to the pretend tonic or the 5 chord. So here we have, instead of the 5 or the dominant chord, now we have the 7 diminished in the pretend key. This relationship is always a half step up. So if your 5 is G, your 7 diminished in the pretend key is always going to be F sharp going to G, F sharp diminished going to G. In this case, it's G major, because the pretend key is G, or the dominant is the one we're decorating is the 5 chord, which is a major chord. This could be a minor chord. We could decorate the 2. We could have a 7 diminished of 2, and then the pretend key would be minor, assuming we're in a major key. I should say this system where you're decorating one of these chords using a secondary dominant or a secondary leading tone chord, I think would be the same term. We call this tonicizing a chord. So we can say that we're going into a pretend key on the dominant here, but we can also say that we tonicize the dominant, which means you just briefly pretend you're in the key of the dominant, and then you give a dominant to tonic, or you make that pretend tonic, and you show that it's a tonic by giving it a dominant or a 7 diminished chord as a substitute for the dominant. Secondary leading tone chords, secondary diminished chords, are not able to follow the descending fifths progression like the secondary dominants were able to do, because these rely on a progression that's up a half step instead of a descending fifth progression like a 5 to 1. So these are always a half step below. And if you ever want to add it in, if I wanted to add it here again, I would take 7 diminished of 4, and I could decorate this one also. So here we have a pretend key of F, and we have 7 diminished going to 1 in the key of F major. Pretending we're in F major just to get 2 chords out of it as a decoration or an expansion of a single chord into 2 chords, so that you get to do something a little more interesting with it, but you don't leave the original key. Then the last thing I want to say about secondary diminished chords is on all of these you have 3 options. You can use the triad as we've done here and here. So far the only thing I've shown you here has been the triad. But we have 2 other options. Instead of using 7 diminished of something, you could use 7 half diminished 7 of something, or you could use, obviously, 7 fully diminished of something. Again, the note on the bottom here, it's kind of like putting 0 in the denominator of a fraction. You are not allowed to do it. So your pretend key, or what's on the bottom, is always your pretend key whenever you have this fraction looking thing. This is your pretend key. It cannot be diminished, and it cannot be 1. It has to be a major or a minor chord, and then on the top part you have 3 options with the secondary diminished. You can use a triad, you can use the half diminished 7, which would be a diminished triad with a minor 7th, or you can use a fully diminished 7th chord, which is a diminished triad with a diminished 7th. Okay, hope that helps.